her how she first fell in love with Welty, and it was one of the two stories that brought me to writing about Eudora Welty, so it was really important to me as well. It is a story set along the Natchez Trace using historical figures, Lorenzo Dow, John Murrell, renamed James by Welty for whatever reason, and John James Audubon. All were in Mississippi, all have a role in Mississippi history. That Lorenzo Dow, an itinerant Methodist evangelist, was born in 1777, died in 1834. John James Audubon, born in 1785, died 1851. And John Murrell, born in 1806, according to contemporary sources, but Robert Coates, Eudora Welty's source, has him born in 1804, died in 1844. In 1820, from the 1820 or so till about 1823, Audubon was studying the birds along the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers. He spent some time in St. Francisville at Oakley Plantation as a tutor for a young girl there. So he was in Mississippi. Dow made a Mississippi tour in 1804. And after 1807, he returned to Mississippi and stayed here for about 13 years. He was traveling all the time, but he had a place around Port Gibson. Murrell is the more problematic. Eudora would have known about Murrell from Robert Coates' book, The Outlaw Years. And according to Coates, Murrell was in Mississippi in 1821 when he would have been about 17. And he killed a man near Natchez. This was not his first murder, but he killed him. He gutted him. He filled him up with rocks and sand and sank him in the swamp. And that was a kind of pattern that he followed. Murrell did have an idea for a slave rebellion organized across the South that would place him in a position of power with a crime empire based in New Orleans. Whether this ever was really a real thing or not, we don't know, but legend has it. And it would have been, it was believed in the 1830s, and people took revenge on those they thought were part of it in the 1830s, but Murrell wasn't here in the 1830s. He was, I think, forget what year he was sent to prison, but something like 1834, something like that, if I have it written down. Anyway, it's legendary, but as Welty casts it, they could have met. And she also was drawing on another bandit, Joseph T. Hare, and stories about him in creating James Murrell for her story. So those are the historical and legendary backgrounds of our story. Any other background information anyone thinks I should provide? Anyone? You see any hands, Jessica? So, okay.
No, I don't.
Let's go on and talk about the story. And Welty has set it up for us in a pretty, Pearl, go ahead. You have something to add.
I just wanted to show you that we've moved our seats for today so that we can show you the Audubon image of the white heron.
Thank you very much.
Okay, that's it.
So I should, if I pick up my computer, I could go over and show you my white heron, which is over in the other corner of this room. But it's not an Audubon. So let's follow Welty's pattern of the story and talk about each of the three characters. Let's talk about the still moment when they meet, and let's talk about the dispersal. So if we divide our discussion up in that way. What about Lorenzo Dow? Here's the first man we meet. So we're going to meet them in this order: Dow, Merle, Audubon. And we might want to think about why this order as well too. But let's first talk about Lorenzo Dow. What do you make of this character? Any insights into Dow? I know that somebody has something.
I see Pearl's hand.
Okay, Pearl. Pearl and Susan.
Well, we have friends from all over South Georgia, and he did come through South Georgia. So there are stories about that. Danielle Pitavisuk, when she reads this story, points out that he is traveling through the Bible Belt, but he is not very spiritual. He's more self-absorbed than really preaching to the crowd kind of thing. So you might keep in mind how he questions the love and separateness, of course, and I'm sure you'll talk about that. But that points out that this is the Bible Belt, but he's not actually doing a very good job against.
Well, yeah, we don't see him in his sermons. And of course, he was famous for his sermons and his autobiography, The History of the Cosmopolite, which Welty references over and over again here. She references Audubon's journals, quotes from Audubon's journals, references material in Coates and Dow. So she had read all of these things. Yeah, but so we have an internal view of him, although we do know that there is that reference to the tin horn. And we know that sometimes when he was preaching, when he got to talking about Gabriel, the horn would sound from high in the trees. And when people found out, they got really mad about it. And, this was not the Gabriel's horn. It was the horn of a young black kid that he had hired to climb up in a pine tree and toot it. And he's reputed to have said, well, think if that scared you that much, think how you'd feel if it were Gabriel's horn. And so we recouped. But yeah, but that's not in there. It's just a fragmentary reference. Susan.
Well, I was struck by the way this story, especially the Lorenzo Dow section, reminded me of young Goodman Brown.
Okay.
And
Eudora loved Hawthorne.
Well, I mean, I think that comes through here. And remember in that story, the way, I mean, we don't really know what's happened. What is he seeing? Is this, when he goes out into the woods, is this all a kind of projection of his own kind of fear of sin or what? And so it's all about perception and, and the questions don't get answered. But I felt the same way with this, especially when he hears those voices inside and, thinks, is that the voice of God? Is that the voice of the devil? And he's more apt to kind of think it's the devil's voice that's telling him to save himself, for instance. So I thought it was a really interesting psychological and religious kind of theme that's working through his part of it.
Yeah, he holds it against himself when he's able to rely on his own judgment, on his own ingenuity. He should have trusted God, and in my self-reliance and my failing God, should I have allowed God to save me in his own way? And yeah, so that is part of the dynamic here, and that goes along with what I think Pearl was talking about with Danielle's reading. Anything else about Dow? Shall we look at a passage? Let's look at this one. Well, I'm tempted to read the first paragraph, but I also want to read another one. So eeny, meeny, miny, mo. I'll start with the first paragraph. Lorenzo Dow rode the old Natchez Trace at top speed upon a racehorse, and the cry of the itinerant man of God, I must have souls, and souls I must have, rang in his own windy ears. He rode as if never to stop toward his night's appointment. It was the hour of sunset. all the souls that he had saved and all those that he had not took dusky shapes in the mist that hung between the high banks and seemed by their great number and density to block his way, and showed no signs of melting or changing back into mist, so that he feared his passage was to be difficult forever. The poor souls that were not saved were darker and more pitiful than those that were, and still there was not any of the radiance he would have hoped to see in such a congregation. Light up in God's name, he called, in the pain of his disappointment. Then a whole swarm of fireflies instantly flickered all around him, up and down, back and forth, first one golden light and then another, flashing without any of the weariness that had held back the souls. These were the signs sent from God that he had not seen the accumulated radiance of saved souls because he was not able, and that his eyes were more able to see the fireflies of the Lord than his blessed souls. Lord, give me the strength to see the angels when I am in paradise, he said. Do not let my eyes remain in this failing proportion to my loving heart always. Okay, so what about that passage? The very first thing we read in the story, it's setting the story up for us. What do you think is important there? Anyone? Beverly, I know you have the answer. We can't hear you.
He seems to be desperate.
Okay.
You know, he is desperate in his quest and not at all as sure of himself as I would think he would be. You know, when I looked up some information about him online, his book was second only to the Bible at one point in sales. And so the desperation, and, you know, I guess a really godly person probably would admit to some doubts. But this opening passage, to me, I just thought he seemed rather fragile.
Fragile, yeah.
Fragile.
And not really aware of the world around him, particularly except for those fireflies. But he's seeing all the souls that he could have saved, that he should have saved, and there's no radiance. Yeah, that doubt in himself.
Suzanne, I'm seeing, I was seeing Pearl, Monica, Miriam, and Pearl, Monica, and Miriam.
Good. Go ahead, Pearl.
I like that opening because it puts us in the Natchez Trace. We know these stories are the pearls strung along the Natchez Trace, but here the Natchez Trace, it's the old Natchez Trace. And so there's already this sense of mystery and the unknown, and he's in a kind of a wilderness, as Beverly said, a wilderness spiritually, because his congregation is not who he's expecting. And so I think that whole idea of the mystery, the way that first love opens up this season of dreams, that all goes along with that. And so although he should be a man of power and assurance, he is not. So I like that word fragile that Beverly suggested.
And the wilderness, of course, is a very Hawthornian use of the wilderness, isn't it? That here is this wilderness of souls, something that needs to be charted, a path found, the wilderness overcome. So that kind of attitude toward the wilderness, opposite of Audubon. So, Monica.
I really like this weird story. And I'm struck with what you read and the description on the next page where he turns half beast and half divine, that he seems to have to lose his humanity and become half animal and half divine. We seem to have this kind of set up hierarchy from the beginning of animal, human, divine, that somehow in the wilderness are all confused.
Good, thank you, Miriam, and then Ray.
I'm glad Monica jumped ahead because I didn't know if that was allowed. But if we go ahead even more, where he's just met Merle and he says, Lorenzo welcomed him and turned fond eyes upon him. I have this addition. So
Yeah, that's okay.
I can't give you the page. To transmute a man into an angel was the hope that drove him all over the world and never let him flinch from a meeting or withhold goodbyes for long. And I love this. This hope insistently divided his life into only two parts, journey and rest. There could be no night and day, and love and despair, and longing and satisfaction to make partitions in the single ecstasy of this alternation. All things were speech. I mean, what beautiful writing.
Yeah, it is. It's
To
a,
me, it gives a different sense of him than you're talking about in the very beginning, which I agree with. But then when I read this, I go, maybe he's not so clueless and self-involved.
right, and I think he's a person who is totally focused on its journey and rest, but he's always focused on what is to come. And he's always hopeful about what is to come. Yeah, Ray.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. Yes. I thought he was an interesting religious figure in that he went back and forth so much. And there are religious figures in history struggled a lot with doubt, and that's Lorenzo Dow. So in that sense, kind of understandable and a normal kind of religious person.
Right, and doubt goes with faith, doesn't it? Yeah. Shall we talk a little bit? Shall we move and talk? I don't want us to run out of time. Let's talk about Merle. Miriam has sort of introduced us to Merle. What about Merle seems notable to you here? I'll read a passage about Merle. Talking about him as a murderer, and in my book it's on 232. This man going forward was going backward with talk. He saw nothing, observed no world at all. The two ends of his journey pulled at him always and held him in a nowhere, half asleep, smiling and witty, dangling his predicament. He was a murderer whose final stroke was overlong postponed, who had to bring himself through the greatest tedium to act, as if the whole wilderness where he was born were his impediment. But behind him and before him, he kept in sight a victim. He saw a man fixed and stayed at the point of death, no matter how the man's eyes denied it, a victim, hands spreading to reach, as if for the first time for life. Contempt. That is what Merle gave that man. Lorenzo might have understood, if he had not been in haste, that Merle, in laying hold of a man, meant to solve his mystery of being. It was as if other men, all but himself, would lighten their hold on the secret upon assault and let it fly free at death. In his violence, he was only treating of enigma. The violence shook his own body first like a force gathering, and now he turned in the saddle.
I see John and then Joe Ellen.
Good. Hey, John.
Hi there. Yeah, I was thinking of a different passage where
It's all right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, where Audubon is studying
Mhm.
Merrill, and he's studying like he would an animal. And he has the perception that the cave air from Cave in Rock, where all the highwaymen hid out, that air had still encompassed Merrill there
Yeah.
on the trunks. I thought that was a really unusual passage and insight into Audubon's unique way of looking at things.
Yeah, he says Audubon saw what he thought of as acquired sorrow, that cumbrousness and darkness from which the naked Indian, coming just as he was made from God's hand, was so lightly free. He noted the eyes, the dark kind that loved to look through chinks and saw neither closeness nor distance, light nor shade, wonder nor familiarity. They were narrowed to contract the heart, narrowed to make an averting plan. Oh, I think that's part of what you were talking about, John.
Yeah, that's the passage.
Joe Ellen.
It seems to me that both Lorenzo Dow and Merle are collectors of men. They're just their souls, and they're both interested only, you mentioned the future, but endpoint. And in fact, on page 231, about 2/3 of the way down, the word revelation is used. A place of long ago, and it was all made for the revelation in the end. And they're different ends, but they both seem interested in collecting men. And in this case, it seems almost as though Merle sees a man fixed and stayed at the point of death, like an insect spread out in a collection. They're laser focused on certain things and don't see much else that's around them.
Yeah, I think of Merle as almost trying to, as being, trying to stop change, trying to fix time and trying to understand people by stopping time and putting it in the past, something that can be known, as if he'll give up, man will give up the secret of his existence. And Lorenzo as focused on the future. And then I see Audubon as the one person who sees the present and can live in the present moment. So yeah, Beverly and then Jacob.
And before them, I'll mention that someone made a point that all three men are collectors in the chat.
Yeah. One of my favorite moments in all of my career of teaching was I was kind of making Audubon the most sympathetic of the three characters. And one of my students threw his book across the room and said, "He killed the bird." So there you are. Beverly.
You know, when I saw, of course, when Merrill came into the picture, we have Lorenzo, who's the prey, and then we have Merrill, who's like the spider, you know, and he's coming to his web. But before we get to that, we see Lorenzo Dow thinking back to when he escaped the Indians. And what he did was just incline. He just threw himself, you know, over front and upon his horse so that if they shot him, they would have to shoot the horse too. So I see him too as sort of inclining to Merrill. He's very passive as this dark man. Welty describes him as dark of countenance. You meet him on the Natchez Trace, and it's almost as if he willingly inclines before Merle as well. I mean, if Audubon hadn't come along, he would have literally been the prey.
Yeah, he's saved by Audubon's appearance.
But he inclines. He does not. He doesn't put up a resistant presence.
Although it does say, doesn't it, that he would like to have grabbed him and taken him by the collar, because he recognizes in him
Evil.
the evil. Yeah, I'm trying to find the passage. Lorenzo welcomed him and turned fond eyes upon him. To transmute a man into an angel was the hope that drove him all over the world and never let him flinch from a meeting or withhold goodbyes for long. This hope insistently, this is the passage I think Monica read, insistently divided his life into only two parts, journey and rest. There could be no day and night, and love and despair and longing and satisfaction to make partitions into the single ecstasy of this alternation. All things were speech. And he says, God created the world and it exists to give testimony. Life is the tongue, speak. But of course, when Merle speaks, it's going to be to declare his death. So, yeah. Okay, Jacob and then Pearl.
Especially for Merle, I in my comments on my text, I wrote next to his passage, he has a terrible case of what I would call first person-itis or main character-itis, in that he even quite literally says at one point at the top of page 232, I am the speechless protagonist when I am killing these men. I become the main character of not only my story, but their stories. And what's interesting about this story is that it's not told in the first person. I think all three of these men have a case of first person-itis. They think intensely from their perspective only. but the story itself kind of invites us as readers to call that into question. These are main characters thinking like main characters, but that doesn't seem to be the story, is what I would bring up.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Jacob. Pearl?
I love how you brought up, Suzanne, that we have the future, the past, and then in Audubon, the present. And that goes right along with the title that Welty chooses for the story, which she uses it later, but a still moment presents a bit of a conundrum because moment is momentum and movement, and it's always changing. And yet this moment of momentum is held still at the moment that Audubon kills the heron. But I also think of these three men, and I think we're set up to think about them separately, and that's what creates the pivotal point when they all three come together under the what I think of as the world tree, the Yggdrasil. But Lorenzo is speech, just as we just reported, and Merle, which I always said Morel, but that could be my northern accent. Merle is all action, and then I see Audubon as all seeing, all observation. So that's another way of thinking of those three men.
It's also, I was going to point out too, I think that Merle is a storyteller. He's a tale teller. He's a writer. And Audubon is another artist. And we can read this as a story about the role of the artist and the compromising position that the artist puts himself in selecting his materials. I think we might think of that. Then I also wanted to point out that when they first see the bird, just before the still moment, each one sees it from his own perspective. Merle looks up and he sees HT, horse thief, that's been branded on his thumb, as it was branded on his thumb. Dow says it's God's love made visible. Audubon thinks a single heron out of its flock, it muddies the water with its foot. So he's that kind of observation, so that each one of them is trapped in that separateness. But with the bird, it seems to me, brings them out of that into a moment of unity, a kind of communion moment when time seems suspended and when their whirlwinds are stopped. A sort of romantic moment of transcendence here. What do you think? Well, let's talk about Audubon. What about Audubon? Audubon was rumored to be the lost Dauphin of France, the son of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. He wasn't, but anyway, that was the rumor. So he thinks about that at one point, his origins. Anyone want to say anything about Audubon? Beverly and Jacob.
Kind of with your student on, that he does kill the bird.
Yeah.
And, that's when you look at Audubon's beautiful paintings or sketches, paintings, I didn't realize for a long time that he did kill, I just looked at them for what they were. This is
Right.
before I knew. And then they took on a less beautiful meaning for me when I realized that that's what he did. Now, nowadays, I guess he would take a camera and he would take a picture and maybe he would use that image. But he, of the deaths there, he's the only one who commits murder when he kills that bird.
Yeah. And he was a crack shot. Audubon was a crack shot, and he killed the birds and posed them so he could paint them. That was his pattern. So all of those prints that we see, all of the birds of America, mark a dead bird. Yeah. Jacob.
And Walter Anderson used animals that he found that were already dead, right?
Who was that? Walter Anderson? I don't know that. Yeah. Jacob.
I wanted to ask a question. Why there seems to be a recurring image through some of the narrations about these men, their fear of transforming into animals. We definitely hear that in Audubon's on page 234. I think we also hear it in Dow. He even says at one point, I'm afraid of being like a heathen centaur. So I'm just posing that question to the group.
All right, well, I'm not going to try to answer that right now, but I'd be glad to hear any answers. Yeah. Who is next? I think it's Ray and then John. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, Ray.
Suzanne, I was interested in Audubon's looking inward, and this is a lot about his identity. So you have to look inward, I guess, to find your identity. And he does look inward, but when he does, he keeps looking outward, so it don't work at all. So he doesn't ever find his identity. And in some sense, I read the story as all of the characters looking for who they are, and that's the identity. And Merrill, for example, tries to release the essence of his victim and find something about life or about identity from doing that. So he's on the same search. But the memory part is interesting too. Joe Mays tried to look at himself and find himself, but he couldn't look into the future. Now, Audubon can't look into himself in another way, but it's the same thing. Joel couldn't find himself in the future. Both a certain kind of memory.
Here's that passage where it says, Audubon thinks, "Oh, secret life, is it true that the secret is withdrawn from the true disclosure, that man is a caveman, and that the openness I see, the ways through forests, the rivers brimming light, the wide arches where the birds fly, are dreams of freedom? If my origin is withheld from me, is my end to be unknown too? Is the radiance I see closed into an interval between two darks, or can it not illuminate them both and discover at last, though it cannot be spoken, what was thought hidden and lost?" It's as if I observing the radiance of the present moment, of the world of nature, of the wilderness, it may illuminate who he is to become, and illuminate and mark his freedom, not a man of predestination, but of freedom to create himself in a sense. Anyway, right.
I was really struck with that too, Suzanne. And the way I read it was that Miss Welty endorsed both possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
It could be between two darks, and it was all dark. So it was darkness, there was no light, or maybe it would be light. So there's a half a loaf, maybe and maybe not. And I think that's very true to life.
Yeah. John.
Yeah, one thing that really struck me about this story is that Welty is really shining a really bright PR light on Mississippi. Here we are, the confluence of all these great people in a very obscure place on the Natchez Trace, and it makes you, well, it makes me, and I assume others, long to go see this place and learn more about Mississippi history. So I know she felt that Mississippi was regarded as a complete backwater, and part of what she was doing was rehabilitating it or shining a light on it. So that part of it I thought was really, really strong.
I love going to those places. I mean, I've done it. I'm with you, John. I wanted to see them. Yeah. Susan.
Yeah, I've been thinking about Jacob's question, about that fear of the animal. I mean, I think it really picks up that whole kind of Puritan fear of the wilderness and the wild.
Right.
You know, it's really an other place. And so here they are out in the wilderness, but it's not only a wilderness, it's a wilderness with the trace running through it. And that's determining their journey in a real way. And what is the trace but a path that was created by the animal? So I think there's this real danger that the animal, because of what they're doing and where they are, is gonna take over. And I think that's Lorenzo Dow's real fear, right?
Yeah, I think
And so when we get the firefly scene, for instance, he refuses to see nature as a symptom of the illumination that God is giving him. Instead, he sees it as a failure of his own link to the divine. With Audubon, I mean, you've got somebody who's asserting, I mean, no matter how much he loves birds, maybe, he's asserting his control over it and fixing it and freezing it into this one still moment that's really a moment of death.
And yeah, for sure, Dow thinks of the wilderness as the wilderness within of souls.
Yeah.
And Merle thinks of the wilderness as an impediment, as
Mhm.
something he has to overcome. And I think Audubon embraces it, but I'm with you. He knew even the sight of the heron, which surely he alone had appreciated, had not been all his belonging, and that never could any vision, even any simple sight, belong to him or to any man. He knew that the best he could make would be, after it was apart from his hand, a dead thing and not a live thing, never the essence, only a sum of the parts, and that it would always meet with a stranger's sight and never be one with the beauty in any other man's head in the world. So he sees his own limits, but he
Yeah.
goes on, but he keeps going. Harriet and Joellen.
So I was going to say, in relationship to the animal question, you know, that we haven't said out loud the obvious elephant in the room, which is the heron. That is the moment of grace in the story, is the appearance of this heron that has, for me, an overwhelming sense of emotional charge, as it does for these three men as they see the beauty of this heron, and that they leave the egotism of Jacob's first description of these men to merge with this thing in the natural world. I have more to say about what happens, I think, at the death of the bird, although I don't know if we're there. You tell me, Suzanne, if we're there or if we should.
Let's talk about this and then come back to the death, or go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So at the moment, fixed in its pure white profile, it stood in the precipitous moment, a plume of corn on its head, its breeding dress extended in rays, eating steadily the little water creatures. There was a little space between each man and the others where they stood overwhelmed. No one could say the three had ever met, or that this moment of intersection had ever come in their lives, or its promise fulfilled. But before them, the white heron rested in the grasses with the evening all around it, lighter and more serene than the evening. Flight closed in its body, the circuit of beauty closed, a bird seen and a bird still, its motion calm as if it were offered, take my flight. And it's a religious experience, and it's a kind of merging, I think, of themselves and the natural world, an experience like Eudora described having in her own garden, feeling at one with the natural world, an experience like those Emerson describes, and I think that's right. At this moment, through the bird, there is this breaking away of this kind of separateness and of this egomania, and a moment of union. And it's a kind of communal, it is a communion. Take my flight, take, eat. This is my body. Yeah, that sort of thing. Maybe I'm gone too far there. Joellen and Ray.
I'm going to give
Coming
it,
back to
I'm
you.
going to refer back to what Ray was talking about.
Yeah.
But in terms of communion, I don't see the three of them. They're stopped by the same thing, but their responses are separate. I don't really see any kind of communion among them. But if going back to what Ray was talking about with the cave, I think that Audubon has been shaken a little bit by his view of Murrell there. And that's when he mentions, if my origin is withheld from me, is my end to be unknown too? And that comes up again in a couple of pages later, where there seems to have been some kind of resolutions toward the bottom of 237. But if it was his identity that he wished to discover, or if it was what a man had to seize beyond that, the way for him was by endless examination, by the care for every bird that flew in his path, etc. And so we talk about his way of life, which is the way of his art. And I think that links directly to what comes immediately next, when he talks about looking outward, almost in order to see, or some people who look outward can also see inwardly at the same time and see the astonishing world. Even when he looks in a mirror, the surface still sees the world looking back at him. It's almost like another kind of still moment for Audubon, I think, that he still has his head in a kind of trance. It reminds me of Welty's nightlight image, where what's outside and what's inside are working together, and in moments of radiance or rapture, of vision, you can see them all at the same time. Then he does to go to the what Harriet mentioned. He recaptures that for a moment. It's gone, but he can recapture to some extent in memory. And on Sunday mornings, when he's looking at his art, there's a transient moment again. But these are all extremely momentary, but his art comes as close as he can get. But it's in the moment of death, when his looking outward has met its limit. And it's important that he remember that. He's big on memory, why he takes all of his notes. I'm not sure whether all that made sense, but in terms of identity, his own personal goals, linking up to his professional art world, I think are beautifully expressed there.
I do think there's a moment of communion, Joellen, because I think when they say its own slow spiral of flight, the bird could take it away at its own time, but for a little it held them still. It laid quiet over them, and they stood for a moment unburdened. So maybe there's not union, but there is a releasing of this focus upon self. When they first see it, they're separate.
Yeah, they share a moment, but.
And there's this moment, but it's transitory, yeah. Ray, and then Harriet, and then Pearl.
Well, I think that comment that you just made is very interesting. I haven't been seeing it that way, but you seem to give a pretty good defense of that. So I'll have to relook at it. But what I want to talk about is the still moment. And that to me is the fulcrum of the story. So it deserves our exploration. And Suzanne, you said one thing that interests me about Miss Welty, which is that she had a feeling of oneness in her garden. So that's a moment with herself. But I would count that in kind of trying to understand what a still moment is. But further, and I'll try to go through this quickly, I wanted to offer examples of still moment rejected and one accepted from Welty. And they're both from Delta Wedding, and the one that's accepted occurred between Laura and George Fairchild. And it was when she took his pipe and then took it back to him and gave it to him. Now, George had a big effect on her, and she felt safe in the house because of him. So that's a lot. So when she brought him the pipe, he accepted it without comment. So he didn't put himself out there on her. He was just there. So she went further, like a child would do. Can I give you anything else? He did not say no. He didn't refuse her. He said no. Well, he did say no, but if so, I will let you know. So he didn't turn her off. Tonight, might be later. And then he lights his pipe in appreciation. That's also nonverbal. And they wound up getting a drink of water, which is a very natural way to end that still moment, which I thought was really beautiful, of course, and a great way for an adult to interact with a child. I'm with my grandson right now. He's 9 years old. I think I'm going to try it. So George simply accepts the moment as it is without putting any kind of fence around her. So that, to me, is a successful still moment. One that is not is the interaction between Ellen and the beautiful Wayfarer girl. The circumstances of that are very similar to what we have in this story. They're in the forest, and the forest is a mysterious place and can be threatening. And as I read it, they tend to out-mother each other. Each other wants to be the mother. That's the fence that they want to put around the other. And allow me to read, if I may, how that lines up. A muscadine fell from a high place into the leaves under their feet, burying itself. It's gone. And falling great, the moment of comfort seemed visible to them and dividing them, and then to be itself lost. How tragic.
Thank you, Ray. Harriet, I think you were responding to that too.
Well, I have to say I agree with you with the image of the glimmering girl in the forest. That is, I think that, you know, I've thought a lot about all of these scenes of female exposure in Welty's work that are it becomes the central moment. And I think this bird is another one. It makes
female, yeah.
It's a female bird, and here we are with the beauty and grace of this bird. And I talking about, we've talked a lot about the differences between the men. I want to talk a little bit more about the similarity between them, in the sense that all of them have obsession with a project that is a strategy for dealing with time and the loss that comes with it. That Tao is going to assert eternity against time. That Muriel is going to he can't stop time and loss and death, but he can control it. He can make it. He can impose it. And Audubon, who is going to record in an effort to preserve, and that this bird comes down, and that there's some kind of spiritual interaction that creates the still moment. And then there's the death of the bird, which I think in the final scenes of the story puts each strategy to the test, lets us evaluate one strategy against another. And maybe we'll say more about each of the responses of the men.
Let's talk about the responses. Well, first Pearl, and then we'll talk about the responses.
Go ahead and talk about the responses first, because that's what I wanted to comment on.
Well, why don't you comment on them?
Well, it seems to me in my reading, although I have to say that I've never taught the story because I've always been afraid of teaching the story. But it seems to me they have that moment of communion. I like your reading of that, and it's a transcendent moment. But the way I read it is that after the killing of the bird and the still moment has passed, they all go their separate ways. They have the opportunity to change, but they do not.
No,
They just proceed on as they had before.
I agree with that. Merle finds himself confirmed in his view. He's been really wanting to confess, but now, no, enough of that. I'm right. I've been right all along. This is the nature of man. Audubon is going to keep going. He's going to keep painting. He recognizes his limits, but he's not abandoning it. And then we have, of course, the great lines from Dow, which we should read and discuss. But first, Harriet.
No, I don't know if it's a first that you should come to me. But I would say that there's a sense in which I think all of these men are artists creating.
I agree with that.
Imposing an image on imposing a strategy for dealing with life and death on artistically, and I think that this is a story about Welty's suspicion of art. I think it's interesting that you say that Audubon would have taken photographs if he were there today, because I start thinking about photography and Welty and her comments about how you can be stealing a life in an image as you freeze it. People's nervousness about being photographed. Well, at any rate, I think
fear of intruding, of violating privacy with the photograph. Yeah. No, I think that's right. It calls art into question. It's her sort of musing about the nature of art to me. Yeah. David. Oops, we're not hearing you, David.
There we go. Is Audubon with killing the birds kind of like Faulkner with, the writer has to be ruthless. If the writer has to rob his mother, he won't hesitate. I guess if you would, rob your mother, you would shoot a bird for the art.
Yeah, I think that is similar. Yeah. And Robert Penn Warren has talked about this too. And of course, his wonderful poem Audubon deals with this whole question, I think. Let's look at the last lines of the story because they're too wonderful not to read, I think. This is Lorenzo. In the woods that echoed yet in his ears, Lorenzo, riding slowly, looked back. The hair rose on his head and his hands began to shake with cold. And suddenly it seemed to him that God himself just now thought of the idea of separateness. For surely he had never thought of it before when the little white heron was flying down to feed. He could understand God's giving separateness first and then giving love to follow and heal in its wonder. But God had reversed this and given love first and then separateness, as though it did not matter to him which came first. Perhaps it was that God never counted the moments of time. Lorenzo did that among his tasks of love. Time did not occur to God. Therefore, did he even know of it? How to explain time and separateness back to God, who had never thought of them, who could let the whole world come to grief in a scattering moment? Lorenzo brought his cold hands together in a clasp and stared through the distance at the place where the bird had been, as if he saw it still, as if nothing could really take away what had happened to him, the beautiful little vision of the feeding bird. Its beauty had been greater than he could account for. The sweat of rapture poured down from his forehead, and then he shouted into the marshes, "Tempter!" He whirled forward in the saddle and began to hurry the horse to its high speed. His campground was far away still, though even now they must be lighting the torches and gathering in the multitudes, so that at the appointed time he would duly appear in their midst to deliver his address on the subject of in that day when all hearts shall be disclosed. Then the sun dropped below the trees, and the new moon, slender and white, hung shyly in the west. All right. So comments on these closing lines? The source of the first significant essay on Eudora Welty, The Love and the Separateness in Miss Welty, that Robert Penn Warren wrote, pattern he saw throughout these stories.
Ray, was that you?
Ray and Pearl. We'll come back to Harriet here too, I think.
Excuse me. Yes, I thought that Lorenzo Dow had a very schizophrenic existence. He was with God and then he was not with God. And I react to what you said in that way. That's all I had to say.
Pearl?
Well, I think that that tempting, when he calls out the tempter, I mean, it has tempted him because he has just, done the Job thing and challenged God, like he's going to teach God about time. So he's definitely out of his element there.
All right. Yeah. It's back to the pattern we saw in the first lines of the story. In fact, yeah. Harriet, you want to finish up on this?
Well, I guess I would say that we're now thinking about the relationship between time, death, and separateness, that this quality, that separateness is central in Welty's work, that the disturbing sequence of love followed by separateness is Dow's best moment, his recognition of something of it, and the possibility of change, which he refuses, as he calls out tempter. And maybe it's implied in Audubon's project. Maybe the recognition of that is implied in Audubon's project. What would you say, Suzanne?
I was going to ask about and see what you all think about the final line there, where the sun dropped below the trees and the new moon, slender and white, hung shyly in the west. Why end with that line, do you think? After these lines about love and separateness, which are so powerful, then we have this one last image.
I think a bunch of us have been thinking across Welty to O'Connor in the story. And I'm struck by the image of the sun in O'Connor's fiction, having religious implications. And I'm just, I feel that ending is very weighted, important.
My sense is that it's another image of the bird, that the new moon, slender and white, hung shyly in the west, that the abundance of nature is still there. It's still available for those moments of communion, despite the scattering moment. Jo Ellen.
I agree with that. And in fact, I think there's an allusion to Revelation in that day when all hearts shall be disclosed.
Mhm.
And the diminishment of that, even that notion of both Merle and Lorenzo Dow. But after all of this high drama and the egoism that comes in again and the speed of Lorenzo Dow at the end, then the sun dropped behind the trees and the new moon, slender and white, hung shyly in the west. And I noted in the chat that the heron is female, the moon is associated with the female, and hanging shyly, it's there, overlooking all of this mess down below, and that's what's left. It's a reminder.
Yeah, I agree with that. Ray? Whoops.
I have a different computer, excuse me. Yes, I agree with the reading and I agree that it's important. And it reminds me of Joel Mays going into the future And he doesn't have a specific place to go, but I have the sense that he's going to land someplace and do well. And this seems to me to be promise and perhaps a new beginning. It's a new moon. So it's somewhat against all the story. As I read it, it's a failed still moment to some extent, not completely. But so it's another poke at how things are going to be in the future.
Let me read you just a few lines from a letter that Eudora sent to her agent, Dermot Russell. She wrote to him, "Every evening when the sun is going down and it is cool enough to water the garden, and it is all quiet except for the locusts and great waves of sound, and I stand still in one place for a long time putting water on the plants, I feel something new. That is all I can say. As if my will went out of me, as if I had a stubbornness and it was melting. I had not meant to shut out any feeling that wanted to enter. It is a real shock because I had no idea that there had been in my life any rigidity or refusal of anything so profound. But the sensation is one of letting in for the first time what I believed I had already felt, in fact, suffered from, a sensitivity to all that was near or around." And I think that's a description in a sense of a kind of still moment that took place at 1119 Pinehurst Street, Jessica, where you are, and
Yes.
Got translated into fiction here. Anyone want a last word? We're going to do a rather different story. Oh, Pearl, go.
I just wanted to say that in the new Eudora Welty review that should be out later this month, Andrew Hicks, one of Sarah Ford's students, has a wonderful short essay about this story being collected in an anthology called Trees, Woods, and the Forests. And he gives a kind of an eco-critical reading of this story within that anthology. So that'll be coming up in the new Eudora Welty review.
Great, thank you. I look forward to that. Next time we have a rather different story, Asphodel. Forward to talking with you all about it. We've run over 3 minutes, but that's not too bad. Okay, I did worse than that in my own classes, I'm sure. All right, see you next week. Bye-bye.